The first light of dawn crept over the horizon like a reluctant truth, pale and thin against the leaden sky. It was March 1944, deep in the occupied territories of France. The war had long since stripped the village of Saint-Marcel of its laughter, its hope, and its youth. The morning smelled of damp stone, ash, and fear, the lingering perfume of a land held hostage. The square, once a place for markets and weddings, now bore the marks of war. German vehicles stood like dark beasts beside the well. Posters in both languages, Achtung, curfew after sundown, fluttered weakly on cracked walls. A chill wind whispered through the empty windows of the bakery, where the owner had been shot 2 weeks prior for selling bread to the Maquis. The echo of that gunshot had never truly faded. Now, in the center of that same square, a young man stood before a firing squad. His name was Jacques Moreau, barely 20 years old, though the days of flight and hunger had carved his face with lines far older. His dark hair was matted, his lips split. His wrists were tied tightly behind his back with coarse rope that bit into his skin. His jacket was gone, his shirt stained from the interrogation that had lasted through the night. Yet, even bruised and bloodied, his eyes burned, a fierce, unbroken flame of defiance. He had been a courier for the resistance, a whisper between cells, carrying messages beneath the seams of his clothes. He had slipped past checkpoints, seen comrades die, and yet never been caught, until yesterday. The Germans had raided a safe house outside town. Jacques had been found hiding beneath a false floor, clutching a satchel filled with coded notes and ration coupons. The verdict had come before the ink on the report was dry. Execution by firing squad at dawn. The villagers knew. They always knew. Curtains remained drawn, doors locked. Still, behind every shutter, someone was watching, praying in silence. A mother clutched her child. A priest whispered a psalm. They had seen many die in that square, but this one felt different. Too young, too human. The German soldiers assembled in rigid formation, rifles gleaming under the gray light. Their boots struck the cobblestone in unison, their breath misting in the cold. They were weary men, most from Saxony and Bavaria, who no longer cared to ask why. They executed orders the way machines discharge steam, automatically, without reflection. Standing apart from them was Oberstleutnant Heinrich Adler, commander of the local garrison. He was in his early 40s, tall, with the kind of posture drilled into men who had lived their entire lives in uniform. His iron-gray hair poked from beneath his officer's cap, his face lined by both age and the weight of command. He had been a soldier since the last war, first a boy fighting in the trenches, now a man upholding the Reich's iron law. His expression revealed nothing, but his eyes, cold, analytical, betrayed a storm of exhaustion. The war was no longer glorious. It was a machine that devoured souls, one order at a time. He watched Jacques with the same detached look he might give a broken weapon. To him, this was another task, one of many that blurred together in the march of duty. Yet somewhere deep inside, something stirred. A faint discomfort, a whisper he tried to silence. As the sergeant called for readiness, Adler's gloved hand brushed against the inside pocket of his overcoat. There, folded neatly, was a letter he had received the previous night, one that had traveled across a continent aflame to find him. He had read it 3 times already, and each time it had struck deeper than the last. The handwriting was delicate, looping, unmistakable, his mother's. Elise Adler, widow of a farmer, devout, stubborn, and gentle, a woman who had watched 2 sons go off to war and had buried one. His younger brother, Otto, had frozen to death somewhere on the Eastern Front the winter before. The army sent only a standard notice and a tag. His mother had written to Heinrich since then almost weekly, but this letter, This one had felt different. Mein lieber Sohn, it began. The spring has come early this year. The apple trees near the church have begun to bloom, though I doubt they will bear much fruit. The war has taken the bees, and even the sky seems too heavy for blossoms. He remembered how she wrote about the neighbors hiding from bombers, about the church bell that still rang every Sunday even though no priest remained. But it was the next paragraph that haunted him. They say, Heinrich, that the soldiers now shoot boys and old men, that they burn villages, that they hang partisans on trees like warnings. Is it true? Tell me it is not. I raised you to fight with honor. You were a good man once. Do not let them turn you into something else. Remember what your father said before he died. Mercy is not weakness. Mercy is what makes men human, even when surrounded by beasts. He had read those words in the flicker of a lantern and felt, for the first time in years, the weight of his own heartbeat. Now, as he stood in the square, her letter pressed against his chest like a second heart, her voice seemed to echo beneath the wind. "Bereit machen," the sergeant called. "Prepare arms." The soldiers lifted their rifles in unison. The metallic clack of bolts sliding back cracked the morning stillness. Jacques straightened his spine, his breath sharp. Adler looked at him. The boy's face reminded him, painfully, of Otto. The same wiry frame, the same frightened eyes that tried not to look frightened. He remembered his brother's last letter. "If I die out here, Heinrich, promise me you'll come home alive. Don't let this war make you forget who we were." "Zielen!" the sergeant shouted. "Aim!" The rifles rose. The air froze. And in that suspended moment, something inside Heinrich Adler broke. His mother's words, his brother's voice, the boy's eyes, they collided like thunder in his chest. He stepped forward. His voice came out as a whisper first. "Stop!" No one heard him. Then louder, sharper, commanding, "Halt!" The shout sliced through the air. The rifles wavered. The soldiers turned, stunned. The sergeant blinked in confusion. Adler's boots clicked on the cobblestone as he advanced toward the line. His face was pale but steady. "Untie him," he ordered. The sergeant hesitated. "Herr Oberstleutnant, the order." Adler's gaze turned to ice. "I said untie him." The tone left no room for argument. The sergeant obeyed, stepping forward reluctantly. The ropes came loose. Jacques' hands fell free, trembling. He stared at Adler as if unsure whether this was mercy or a trick. Adler turned slightly, his voice calm but edged with steel. "The example has been made. The village has seen what happens when one defies the Reich. We need not waste bullets on a corpse." It was a dangerous lie, one meant to save both the boy and himself. He leaned closer to Jacques, speaking low in accented French. "Run, disparaissez, go, and don't look back." For a heartbeat, the world was still. Then Jacques turned and fled, vanishing into the alleys that led toward the forest. His figure disappeared between the houses, swallowed by morning mist. The square was silent. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to pause. Adler turned back to his men, expression unreadable. "Clean this up," he said. "We have patrols to resume." And then he walked away, his steps echoing hollowly through the empty street. That night, in his quarters, he sat beneath a dim lamp. The letter lay open on his desk, the handwriting now worn from his touch. He took out a sheet of paper and wrote, "Mother, today your words saved a life. Perhaps they saved mine as well." He stopped. the pen trembling in his hand. For the first time since the war began, Heinrich Adler wept. Not for the fallen, not for the dead, but for what little of himself still remained alive. When dawn broke the next morning, the villagers found the square empty again. No one spoke of what had happened, but behind shuttered windows, whispers began. Of the German officer who had stopped the rifles, of the miracle that had come not from heaven, but from one man's heart, reminded by the voice of his mother. He never sent the letter he wrote that night, but he carried both, his mother's and his own, folded together in his coat pocket for the rest of the war, as a shield against the darkness he had once obeyed without question. And somewhere in the hills, a boy named Jacques ran until his lungs burned, carrying the echo of that single word that had given him back his life: halt. The days that followed the halted execution passed in a haze of tense silence. St. Marcel returned to its trembling rhythm. Villagers whispering of miracles behind shuttered windows, German patrols marching with uneasy precision, and Oberstleutnant Heinrich Adler performing his duties with the ghost of a secret in his chest. He had defied a direct order, and in Nazi Germany, mercy was a crime. He knew the consequences. Disobedience, even wrapped in logic, could mean the end. Court-martial, imprisonment, a bullet in the back from his own men. Yet for 2 weeks no word came. Perhaps the chaos of war had hidden his transgression, or perhaps fate was granting him a reprieve. But deep down, he knew silence in wartime was never mercy. It was the breath before the blow. On the 14th day, the black cars came. They rolled into the square like thunderclouds. 2 Gestapo vehicles, their engines humming with cold authority. Villagers vanished into their homes. Even the garrison soldiers stiffened, stepping back instinctively as the officers emerged, trench coats black as mourning cloth. Their armbands bled red against the gray world. At their head walked Sturmbannführer Klaus Reiter, a man known across the region for his efficiency in cleansing suspected resistance cells. His eyes were the color of wet slate, his smile thin and deliberate. He spoke with the tone of a man accustomed to obedience. "Oberstleutnant Heinrich Adler," he announced as he entered the command office. "By order der Sicherheitsdienst, you are to accompany us to Rennes for questioning regarding the failed execution of the resistance courier Jacques Moreau." The name landed like a gunshot. They knew. Adler rose calmly, buttoning his overcoat. "Of course, Sturmbannführer," he said evenly. "I assume this is a formality." Reiter's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Formality, yes, but even formalities can be fatal, Colonel." The trip to Rennes was long and silent. The landscape passed in gray blurs. Villages burned out, fields turned to mud, and distant flashes of artillery marking the slow collapse of German power in the West. Adler sat in the back of the car, his wrists resting on his knees, his mind tracing the edges of his mother's letter in his pocket. He replayed every moment of that morning, the rifles, the hesitation, the boy's eyes. He wondered if Jacques had survived. He wondered if he would regret what he had done if he hadn't. But each time his conscience whispered, he felt his mother's words steady him like a hand on his shoulder. Mercy is not weakness. The Gestapo headquarters in Rennes was an old courthouse, its marble halls now stained with the echoes of screams. He was led through corridors where doors remained closed, but the sound of suffering leaked through the cracks. The air smelled of disinfectant and fear. Inside a dimly lit chamber, 3 officers sat behind a long oak table, papers neatly stacked before them. A single chair waited in the center of the room. Adler was told to sit. The tribunal began. Colonel Heinrich Adler, the presiding officer, began, his tone clipped and official. "We have received intelligence suggesting that the condemned French saboteur, Jacques Moreau, escaped execution under your command. Eyewitness reports conflict. Some claim the boy fled before the rifles fired. Others, that you halted the procedure yourself." Adler's posture remained perfect. "The prisoner escaped during transport to the site, Herr General. My men were ambushed by resistance fighters near the square." "Ambushed?" The second officer leaned forward. "No reports of gunfire were recorded." Adler didn't blink. It was swift. A diversion. Smoke grenades, perhaps. "My men were ordered to regroup. In the confusion, the prisoner disappeared." The room fell into silence. Only the scratching of a fountain pen broke it. The Gestapo officers watched him like wolves measuring a wounded stag. Reiter finally spoke from the shadows. "You expect us to believe that the resistance, bold enough to ambush a firing squad, left no trace? No casualties?" Adler met his gaze evenly. "You can check the rifles. No shots fired. No soldiers lost. I acted to preserve German lives, not expend them for pride. The result, a single escaped courier, is regrettable, but not catastrophic. My duty, first and foremost, is to command efficiently." The third officer, older and quieter than the rest, studied Adler's face for a long moment. Something in the man's composure, his calm, his control, betrayed not guilt, but exhaustion. Perhaps this older officer, himself a veteran of too many fronts, saw in Adler what he feared in his own reflection, a soldier holding on to the last threads of his humanity. After a pause, he leaned back. "What is your service record, Colonel?" 23 years. Infantry and logistics. Frontline command since 1939. Decorations? Iron Cross, first and second class. Wound Badge, silver. Service Medal. The man nodded slowly. "Very well." He turned to his peers. "We can afford to lose one courier. We cannot afford to lose discipline among officers of Colonel Adler's caliber. I propose a formal reprimand and reassignment to non-combat duties. His loyalty is noted, even if his judgment was unconventional." Reiter's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The others murmured their assent. The verdict was given an hour later. Adler was stripped of field command and reassigned to a logistics division near Rouen. No imprisonment, no firing squad, just the slow exile of paperwork and warehouses, a living purgatory for a man who had once led soldiers. As he signed the order, Adler exhaled quietly. He knew it was mercy of another kind, rare, fragile, undeserved. That night, confined to a small room in the garrison, he unpacked his few belongings. Among them, a photograph of his mother and brother, and her letter. He unfolded it once more. The paper had grown soft, the creases worn white from his touch. "They say soldiers now shoot boys and old men. Remember what your father said, mercy is not weakness." He read the words aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Then, for the first time since the tribunal, he allowed himself to breathe freely. He had faced judgment and survived. But survival came at a cost. His men would hear rumors that he had been demoted for leniency. The Gestapo would keep watching. Every order he gave from now on would be weighed against that single morning in St. Marcel. Yet, when he closed his eyes, he did not see the tribunal. He saw Jacques, alive, running, vanishing into the mist, and he felt, for the first time in years, that something in him had been salvaged from the fire. Weeks later, Adler arrived at his new posting, a supply depot outside Rouen, far from the front. It was a graveyard of crates, broken vehicles, and weary men marking time until the inevitable collapse. The Allied bombers came almost nightly now, shaking the earth with their relentless hunger. Here, among the endless paperwork and the drumming of distant artillery, Adler found a kind of quiet punishment. He followed orders, but never again did he sign an execution order without question. Whenever one came across his desk, he delayed it with bureaucratic precision, lost paperwork, incorrect dates, missing stamps. Small acts of rebellion that no one could prove. Each evening, when the sirens fell silent and the searchlights died, he would sit beneath the shattered roof of his quarters, unfold his mother's letter, and read it again by candlelight. The paper trembled in his hand. The words never changed, but somehow they grew heavier. He began to believe, quietly and fully, that mercy was the last act of defiance left to a good man in a bad army. And so, in the ruins of occupied France, a German officer who had stopped one execution began waging a quieter war, not against enemies, but against the part of himself that once believed orders were absolute. For the first time, Heinrich Adler no longer feared death. He feared becoming the kind of man who no longer questioned it. Winter came to Normandy like a dying breath, slow, bitter, and gray. The war was turning. Everyone knew it, though few dared say it aloud. Allied planes screamed overhead daily, and the once proud banners of the Reich hung limp and tattered over the command buildings. The radio spoke of strategic withdrawals, but the soldiers knew what that meant. Retreat, collapse, the end creeping closer each night with the sound of distant guns. Colonel Heinrich Adler, now stripped of his field command and buried in the logistics corps near Rouen, lived in a world of ledgers and ration slips. Each morning, he walked through long rows of supply crates, ticking off numbers that no longer mattered. Diesel, ammunition, food for divisions that no longer existed. The paperwork was endless, the futility total. But within the dull repetition, Adler found strange solace. He had become invisible, another faceless officer lost in the wreckage of a crumbling army. The Gestapo had forgotten him, or so it seemed. He was useful, compliant, and forgotten. It was the perfect place for a man quietly waging his own private rebellion. Every day, he sabotaged the machine just a little more. An order misplaced, a transport delayed, fuel shipments rerouted to rural hospitals instead of tank units. His defiance was hidden behind bureaucracy, war fought with ink instead of bullets. It wasn't heroism, not in the way the French resistance understood it, but it was something, a spark in the ashes. At night, when the bombardment stopped, he would light a single candle and read the letter again. His mother's handwriting now faded, the paper thin as breath. Sometimes he could still hear her voice in the silence. Mercy is not weakness. Those words had once saved a boy's life. Now they saved his soul. One evening, as the winter wind howled through the broken glass of his office window, a young private appeared at the door. His uniform was soaked from the rain, his face pale and tight with urgency.
"Herr Oberstleutnant," the boy stammered, "there's a visitor asking for you at the checkpoint. Says his name is Jacques Moreau."
The world stopped. Adler rose slowly, his hand tightening on the edge of the desk. "Repeat that." "Yes, sir. Jacques Moreau. He's not in uniform. Civilian clothes. Says it's urgent." For a long moment, Adler couldn't move. The name hung in the air like a ghost come to claim its due. He thought it impossible, a trap, perhaps, or a trick by the Gestapo to test his loyalty again. But curiosity, or perhaps fate, drove him forward. He followed the private through the wet courtyard to the gate. The night was quiet, except for the wind hissing through the barbed wire. There, standing under the dim yellow light of a guard lamp, was a man in a long coat, face half hidden beneath a hood. Mud stained his boots, and his eyes burned with recognition.
"Colonel Adler," the man said in accented German. "You remember me?"
Adler studied him carefully. The face was older now, thinner, but unmistakable. Jacques Moreau, the boy who should have died in Saint-Marcel.
"My God," Adler whispered, "you're alive!"
Jacques smiled faintly. "Because of you." The guards looked uncertainly between them, hands on their rifles. Adler gestured for them to stand down. "He's with me," he said sharply. They obeyed, though uneasily. To them, this was madness, their commanding officer speaking in whispers with a known French saboteur. Adler led Jacques into the storage hall, where the roar of the wind muffled their voices. He closed the door behind them. The flicker of a single oil lamp threw long shadows across the room.
"I shouldn't be here," Jacques began, his voice low but steady. "If they catch me, it's over. But I had to find you. I needed to tell you something."
Jacques reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, old, yellowed, and sealed with a wax imprint. "Because this belongs to you." Adler took it with trembling hands. The wax bore a familiar symbol, his family crest. He tore it open, and there, in faded ink, was his mother's handwriting again. But it wasn't the same letter.
It was new.
Dated 6 months after the last one. His eyes darted across the page. "My dear Heinrich, they told us that France burns, that our soldiers do what they must, but I do not believe that cruelty is duty. Your brother Hans was executed for helping a captured pilot escape near Hamburg. They said it was treason. I say it was mercy. If this letter ever finds you, know that the world is breaking, but I still believe that even among ashes, goodness can survive. Remember what you once did. Hold on to it. Mother." Adler's breath caught. His brother, executed. He gripped the letter as though it could bring him back. "How did you get this?" he asked hoarsely. Jacques smiled sadly. "After you spared me, I joined the Maquis full-time. We ambushed a mail convoy near Le Mans 3 months ago. Your name was on one of the undelivered envelopes. I kept it. I thought, if you were still alive, you should have it." Adler sank into a chair, the weight of everything collapsing at once. The years of silence, the guilt, the endless faces of the dead. He pressed the letter to his forehead. "She believed in something better," he murmured, "even as everything fell apart." Jacques hesitated, then said quietly, "So did you, Colonel. That day, you believed." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. The war was drawing closer, the front lines breaking, the Reich retreating step by step. Both men knew their meeting could not last. "I need to go," Jacques said. "The Allies are advancing. We have people waiting near the river. But before I leave," he looked at Adler with an intensity that cut through the cold, "you may not see the end of this war, Colonel, but when they write about it, I'll tell them there was one German who remembered mercy." Adler's throat tightened. "You owe me nothing." Jacques shook his head. "No, I owe you everything." He turned to leave, pulling his hood up, vanishing into the storm outside. Adler stood at the doorway, watching as the shadow of the man disappeared into the night, swallowed by rain, by destiny, by the madness of history. For a long time he stayed there, the letter in his hand. The rain soaked it through, the ink bleeding into his fingers until it looked like blood. That night, as bombs fell on Rouen and the depot shook under fire, Adler made his decision. He gathered every order that condemned civilians to death, reprisals, hangings, executions, and fed them one by one into the furnace. pages curled and blackened, the flames licking the lies clean. When dawn came, nothing remained but ashes. And in those ashes, Adler finally understood the meaning of his mother's words. Mercy was not weakness. It was rebellion, the purest form of defiance left in a world built on obedience and fear. By the spring of 1944, the German army in northern France was collapsing like a dying beast. Allied bombers ruled the sky, and the roads that once carried endless convoys of German might were now graveyards of twisted steel and ash. Ruin had become a ruin, a broken city clinging to the illusion of order under an empire that was already burning. Colonel Heinrich Adler stood on the observation balcony of the supply depot, his greatcoat flapping in the cold wind. Below him, trucks rattled through the mud, carrying crates that would never reach their destination. His men worked with mechanical obedience, but there was no purpose left in their eyes. They knew the truth. Germany was losing, and no one could stop it. The letter from his mother lay in his breast pocket, the paper worn and soft against his heart. He read it every morning now, like a prayer, like an oath. The words were his compass in a world without north. He had spent months quietly sabotaging orders, hiding refugees in transport trucks, burning execution lists. But the war was changing fast, too fast for even small mercies to survive much longer. The Gestapo had begun tightening its grip again, desperate to enforce discipline as the front collapsed. Every week, another officer was arrested for defeatism. Every night, another train left for the east, carrying prisoners whose names would never be remembered. Then, one gray morning, the summons came. It was Reiter again. Sturmbannführer Klaus Reiter, the same cold-eyed Gestapo officer who had once interrogated him in Rennes. His presence alone carried the stench of final judgment. He arrived unannounced, his convoy rolling into the depot with the quiet menace of a guillotine. Adler watched from his office window as the black cars stopped in the courtyard, boots crunching against frost. Soldiers stiffened. Conversations died. Reiter entered without knocking. His uniform was immaculate, his gloves spotless, his expression unreadable. He regarded Adler for a moment before speaking. "Colonel Adler," he said with mocking politeness, "still keeping the Reich's supplies flowing, I see." Adler stood at attention. "As best as circumstances allow, Sturmbannführer." "Ah, yes, circumstances." Reiter circled the room slowly, running his gloved finger across Adler's desk. A curious thing, circumstances. They reveal much about a man's loyalties. He turned sharply. "We have intelligence that several of your convoys were sabotaged, crates of ammunition missing, transport trucks that never reached their assigned divisions, and reports," he let the word hang, "that certain French nationals were seen escaping under German escort. Do you have an explanation?" Adler didn't flinch. "Supply lines are chaos, Sturmbannführer. Roads are destroyed, bridges gone. If you seek perfection in logistics under bombardment, you'll find disappointment everywhere." Reiter stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floor. "And if I seek betrayal?" Silence. The ticking of the wall clock filled the space between them. Then, quietly, Adler said, "You will not find that here." Reiter smiled thinly. "We'll see." He turned to the guards behind him. "Search the premises, every ledger, every crate, every desk. Burn what's suspicious." The depot erupted into motion. Soldiers poured through the corridors, overturning boxes, ripping through records. Adler remained still, his mind racing. He had burned most of the evidence, but not all. There were names hidden in the ledgers, The villagers he'd smuggled to safety, the false requisitions he'd signed. If Ryder's men found them, it was over. He moved quietly to the corner cabinet, where a pile of obsolete documents sat under a tarp. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 forged orders, the last of his falsified files. They bore signatures that could damn him instantly. He hesitated only a second, then tore them into pieces and fed them into the iron stove beside his desk. The paper curled and blackened, the smoke rising like ghosts into the cold air. Ryder reappeared in the doorway just as the last ember died. "Burning evidence, Colonel?" he asked smoothly. Adler turned, unshaken. "Old manifests, pointless paperwork. The fuel keeps us warm." Ryder studied him for a long, quiet moment. Then, with unsettling calm, he said, "You're a difficult man to read, Adler. I've met zealots and traitors, cowards and idealists, but you," he leaned closer, "you look like a man who still believes in something." Adler met his eyes. "Perhaps I do." "What is it?" Ryder asked, voice low. "God? Country?" Adler's gaze was steady. "Mercy." Ryder blinked. Once, slowly, as if the word had come from a foreign language. Then he laughed, quietly at first, then louder, the sound echoing through the cold room. "Mercy," he repeated. "That's rich. The world doesn't need mercy, Adler. It needs order." He turned and walked out, still laughing. "Order built this Reich. Mercy will bury it." That night, the depot came under bombardment. Allied aircraft, their engines droning like iron bees, swept in from the west. The sirens screamed. Searchlights slashed through the darkness. The first wave of bombs fell on the far side of the city, flashes of orange tearing through the clouds. The earth shook. Windows shattered. Fire bloomed across the horizon. Adler ran to the communications room, shouting orders to evacuate. "Get the men to the bunkers! Save the civilians first!" His voice cut through the chaos, commanding with the same force that had once led battalions through hell. In the confusion, he saw Ryder again, shouting at his own men, dragging files into his car. The Gestapo officer's face was pale, his arrogance cracked. "We're leaving," he barked. "Rennes is gone. Le Havre's gone. Ruin's next." Adler ignored him. He ran toward the warehouse, where a group of local workers, French prisoners and civilians, were trapped under debris. He climbed over fallen beams, his uniform streaked with dust and blood, pulling one man free, then another. The air was thick with smoke and screams. A massive explosion tore through the yard, the ammunition dump. The shock wave threw Adler to the ground. He rose, coughing, blood on his lips. The warehouse was a blazing inferno now. He looked around and saw Ryder pinned beneath a collapsed girder, his leg crushed, his pistol just out of reach. Their eyes met through the firelight. "Adler!" Ryder shouted. "Help me!" For a moment, time froze. The world roared around them, fire, falling steel, the thunder of death overhead. Adler could have walked away. He could have left Ryder to the flames, and no one would have questioned it. The man was his enemy, his accuser, the embodiment of everything Adler despised. But then he heard his mother's voice again, as clear as if she were standing beside him. "Mercy is not weakness." He turned back. With inhuman effort, Adler lifted the burning beam, the heat searing through his gloves, and dragged Ryder free. The man gasped in disbelief, clutching his shattered leg. "Why?" he croaked. "Why save me?" Adler, breathing hard, looked down at him. "Because someone has to."
He carried Reiter out into the open air as the depot collapsed behind them. Fire rained from the sky. The city burned like a dying star. The war, their war, was ending. When dawn came, the Allied tanks were already rolling through the outskirts. The German lines had broken. The remnants of the garrison surrendered without a fight. Adler sat on a ruined wall, his coat blackened, his hands raw. Beside him, Reiter lay unconscious, his leg bandaged crudely. The letter in Adler's pocket was gone, burned in the fire. But he didn't need it anymore. The words lived in him now, etched into the marrow of his soul. He looked out across the ruined city and whispered, "It's over." Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring, the sound of liberation, of an ending bought with fire and mercy alike. The war ended not with victory, but with silence. When the guns fell quiet and the banners of the Reich were torn down, Europe awoke to its own scars. Cities were no longer cities, only skeletons of stone and ash. Rivers ran black with the soot of burned machines. And the men who survived walked among the ruins like ghosts, each carrying invisible wounds heavier than any metal. In one such ruin, among the gray fields of Normandy, a man named Heinrich Adler sat on the cold steps of a destroyed church and waited to be judged. He had survived the fall of Rouen, though barely. He had carried Reiter to safety that night, the same Reiter who once sought to condemn him. The Allied medics who found them both under the rubble did not know who was who. They saw only 2 Germans covered in blood. They sent them both to a makeshift prisoner camp outside Bayeux. The camp was quiet, almost reverent in its misery. The war was over, and the victors were too tired to hate. There was no shouting, no vengeance, only waiting. For food, for names, for absolution that would never come. Adler spent his days in silence. His uniform was gone, replaced by a tattered prisoner's coat. He kept his hands busy, fixing fences, mending boots, cleaning tools. Anything to stay moving, to keep the ghosts away. The letter, his mother's final words, had burned with the depot, but he carried it still inside him. Every morning, as dawn crept through the fog, he would close his eyes and recite what he remembered. Mercy is not weakness. Remember what you once did. Hold on to it. He had no illusions left. He was no hero, no saint, just a man who had once stopped one execution and failed to stop 1,000 others. Yet in that single act, he had learned that redemption was not found in victory or survival, but in choice. Months passed. The Allies began sorting through the prisoners, separating the monsters from the men who had simply obeyed. There were trials, interrogations, endless testimonies. Everyone wanted to know who had done what, who had killed, who had resisted, who had dared to say no. When they called Adler's name, he went quietly. The tribunal was held in a small schoolhouse outside Caen, its walls still pocked with bullet holes. British officers sat behind wooden tables, their expressions hard but not cruel. There were translators, clerks, and a single French liaison, a woman in a dark coat with grief in her eyes. The air smelled faintly of chalk and tobacco. "Name?" the officer asked. "Heinrich Adler," he replied. "Former rank?" "Oberstleutnant, Logistikskorps, Rouen Sektor."
The officer nodded, flipping through papers. "You are accused of falsifying orders, obstructing executions, and aiding enemy civilians. Do you deny these charges?"
Adler hesitated. "No." The officer looked up sharply. "You admit to aiding the enemy?" "I admit," Adler said slowly, "to helping the innocent." There was a pause. The translator whispered to the French liaison, who studied Adler's face with something like curiosity.
Then she spoke in soft, deliberate German.
"Colonel Adler," she said, "do you remember a village called Saint-Marcel?"
He froze. His pulse hammered in his throat. "Yes," he said, "I do."
She placed a folder on the table and opened it. Inside was a photograph, a grainy black-and-white image of a young man standing beside a group of Allied soldiers. He looked older, stronger, but unmistakably familiar.
Jacques Moreau. He gave testimony, the woman said quietly. He said a German officer spared his life when he was to be executed. That officer's name, he told us, was Heinrich Adler.
For the first time in years, Adler forgot to breathe.
The officer leaned back, exchanging glances with his colleagues. "Is that true, Colonel?"
Adler lowered his gaze. "It was not loyalty that made me act. It was my mother's letter. I thought, if she could believe in mercy while the world burned, then perhaps I could too."
No one spoke for a long time.
Outside, the wind rattled the shattered windows like a dying clock.
Finally, the British officer closed the folder. "The court recognizes the testimony of Jacques Moreau, now serving with the Free French Forces. Given your actions, Colonel, the tribunal will not pursue charges. You will be released."
Adler blinked. The words barely registered. Released. The words sounded foreign, a language from before the war. He nodded once, silently.
"Thank you," he said, though it felt inadequate.
The French liaison rose and offered her hand. He hesitated, then took it. Her grip was warm, human. "Jacques asked me to tell you something," she said softly. "He said, 'The world will remember the day a German chose mercy.'" Adler closed his eyes. For the first time in a decade, he felt something like peace.
He never returned to Germany. There was nothing left there. His mother gone, his brother executed, his home reduced to rubble. He stayed in France, working as a carpenter in a small town rebuilt from the bones of war. He never wore a uniform again. The years passed quietly. He lived simply, anonymously, refusing any recognition. When people asked his name, he said only, Heinrich. The rest was buried with the dead. But the story did not end there. In 1956, a letter arrived at the post office of Saint-Marcel. It was addressed, simply, to the German officer who chose mercy. Inside was a short note written in neat French script. "You may not remember me, but I remember you. I was Jacques Moreau. I am alive, married, and a father now. I named my first son Heinrich. My mother still prays for the man who spared me that day. The world has enough hatred, Colonel. You gave it a little grace. Thank you, J. Moreau." Adler read it under the same oak tree where he had once sat to rest his broken hands after the war. He smiled, the kind of smile that hurts because it carries a lifetime. He folded the letter and placed it in a wooden box beside his tools. That night, he wrote back, "Dear Jacques, I do remember. Not the uniform, not the war, but the look in your eyes when you saw that I had spared you. That look has followed me longer than the sound of bombs. You named your son Heinrich. Then perhaps something good survived after all. Tell him that his name once belonged to a man who failed often, but tried once to be kind. That will be enough. Heinrich Adler." He never knew if the letter reached its destination, but in time, it didn't matter. When Heinrich Adler died in 1963, he was buried in a small cemetery on the edge of Saint-Marcel, the same ground that had once nearly become his place of execution. His grave was simple, no rank, no titles, only his name and 2 words carved beneath it, chosen by the villagers who remembered him. He chose mercy. Years later, school children visiting the war memorial would stop at his grave,
asking their teachers who he was. And they would be told the story of the German officer who disobeyed orders, who saved a boy with a single act of compassion, who carried his mother's letter into the heart of hell and came out human. The letter itself was gone, but its words had done what armies could not. They had outlived the war. And somewhere, across the sea, a man named Jacques Moreau, now gray-haired and weathered, would look at his son and whisper the same words that once saved him. Mercy is not weakness. It is strength. And it is forever.